I would just like to address some things that have come up, bumps in the road in other states. I will say this, I was kind of bouncing stuff off of Mike in the car when we were driving back from the airport, and it was kind of a cat and mouse thing, because I kept coming up with stuff, and he'd be like, well, yeah, we knew that, and we addressed that, and yeah, well, we do that in the rider, and we've got that covered. And so, you know, to your credit, you know, there's a lot of stuff that has come up that you've already covered now. As the lawyer, though, I have to tell you, there will still be problems, there will still be blood. So let me just hit a few of these, and you can get a sense for what's happened out there. Do we have my, how do I advance?
Advance it with this here.
All right, we're not too extensive. Credentials. That has been an issue in some states. Specifically, insurance companies are used to dealing with licensed providers acting within the scope of their license. That's just kind of coin of the realm. So they have to get their minds around the situation where you have a field of practitioners, board-certified behavior analysts, who typically are not licensed. There is not licensure. There are some states now that have licensed. There are some states that have licensed basically on the basis of the BCBA credential, but it's by no means pervasive. Now, you've handled that here through reference to the Medicaid waiver, and that was actually similar to what South Carolina did. There had been a trail blazed, so there was already a sense of here's how we can make sure that we have properly credentialed and qualified people, and that's really what the concern is among the insurance companies. So I think you've covered that, but just be aware, what happens sometimes is once your insurance really gets rocking and rolling, you get these kind of stray insurance companies. They may have only one policy holder or something, and they don't know anything about it. You have to educate them, and you need to be able to prepare to say, here's how it works. So just be prepared for that. Next thing I want to talk about are, how did I put all those on one? That's fine. Policy issues. And I've lumped under policy issues. That's nothing you need to get used to, especially if you're a provider, but really even if you're a parent. You need to start to understand insurance policies. If you read them enough, there is a logic to them. There are exemptions here, then you've got to put your finger here and kind of put it here at the same time, but it makes sense ultimately if you've seen them enough as a provider. So just remember that it's the policy what it's all about. One issue that's come up across the country in many states is in-network versus out-of-network, as I call it. There are some instances where companies have basically tried to say, well, you can only get in-network coverage. Okay, we're not going to allow out-of-network coverage. There are various responses to that. It may be that there is pursuant to the policy itself or pursuant to rules or regulations of your Department of Insurance. If you offer insurance coverage that has both an in-network and an out-of-network component to all conditions other than autism, that's a problem. And typically there'll be a reason you can't do that. On the federal level, there's a statute that you should be aware of called the Federal Mental Health Parity Act, or Wellstone-Domenici Act. And what that basically says is that you cannot have quantitative or qualitative limitations that are different for mental health coverage than they are for your physical coverage in the same policy. And for purposes of that statute, autism is considered a mental illness because it's in the DSM. So without getting into the whole background of whether that is or not, just for legislative purposes it is, so that you can look to that if you have an issue where there seems to be unequal, uneven, or disparate treatment of autism. Another issue that comes out in the in-network, and we've kind of talked about this, and the insurance companies will encourage you as a provider to be in-network. And remember, for the parents, that's a good deal. It's typically a better deal to be in-network. So there's nothing inherently a problem about that. There's also a third category I'm not going to get into much that generally hasn't been a problem, but those are special individual contracts. But on the in-network, the one thing that can be somewhat of a difficult process for providers who have not been part of the insurance industry, if you will, is the negotiated rates aspect. They're not used to dealing with an insurance company who's going to want to negotiate rates and maybe have some other strictures or limitations. My only advice on that is to providers, make sure that you do not compromise your quality, that you do not underbid yourself. You have to charge a rate that is going to allow you to deliver the service that you are delivering, that the parents are entitled to get, and that the insurance company is contractually agreed and is obligated to give, which is quality ABA services. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but it's just in the heat of the moment when all of a sudden you're negotiating, you need to keep that in mind. Another thing we see are the frequency of reviews, and gatekeeping hoops can sometimes be a problem. Sometimes where there's a review kind of, every 3-4 months, and basically you're just catching your breath. You never have time to actually make any progress because all you're doing is filling out paperwork. So that's an impediment. I would look to Wellstone Domenici for that, see if it's the same kind of limitations that are imposed on physical coverage. But I understand, and this is where Mike was coming back to me, you've kind of, in your statute, I believe it says 6 months. So, that's fine. Those are your marching orders. Some statutes have it as 12 months or a year. But one thing to be sure of is make sure that you've got proper people who are doing that review. And by proper, I mean if it's applied behavior analysis, you should have a board-certified behavior analyst doing the review because they are the ones in a position to know and to monitor that treatment. So anyway, these are reasonable requirements. Your job is just to make sure they stay reasonable. Billing issues, CPT codes, that came up. There are no national CPT codes at this point. That's something that's in the works. In some states, it's been difficult getting those CPT codes. I mean, here it sounds great because the insurer has been forthcoming and said, here's our codes, please use them. That's wonderful. Believe it or not, in some states, you have some insurance companies that are very closed about their codes. They're almost like proprietary information. They don't want to let you have them. And you literally get into circumstances, because remember, insurance companies are large institutions where you may be talking to someone at a certain level, and you're like, tell me the code to bill. I can't tell you that, but submit your bill. And so it's kind of like Russian roulette. You just keep submitting the bill. So you want to have a mechanism so that is not an issue. It should not be an issue. Now, Indiana, for example, the Department of Insurance just promulgated codes and said, okay, these are the codes that everyone will use. And so it just eliminated it as an issue. If you've got a narrow number of insurers at this point and they're all willing to just say, here's our codes, it's not an issue, that's great. Just be advised that can be an issue in other states, and just be on top of that as you appear to be. Another issue is educating insurance companies about billing to BCBAs. And again, I think your statute kind of addresses this in the rider where you talk about the BCBA and you talk about, is it the autism specialist qualification? I mean, the most efficient thing that has happened in states where they've tried to figure out how to do this is essentially payment goes to the BCBA. And the BCBA has folks working at her supervision or direction, and that's how the compensation occurs, rather than trying to parse it out to each individual line therapist. Again, the reason is because the model for the delivery of applied behavior analysis is different in many ways than a typical healthcare practice, because you have a team approach. And so the billing needs to kind of reflect that. The most efficient billing takes that into account. You also need to educate providers. I mean, a lot of providers are kicking and screaming into the insurance age. And I'll tell you right now that in many states, the big providers, they've all gone and they've gotten billing specialists, just like many other medical practices. Most medical practices now has someone in that back room who knows the codes, and that person is very valuable. And that's what you need. And I would heartily recommend, if your business can stand it as a provider, to look into people like that. You also need to make sure that your levels of review within the insurance company, and if you have external reviews that are overseen by your Department of Insurance, that those are appropriately staffed now. I can tell you, when I went to South Carolina and I talked to the Department of Insurance, and I knew that they routinely certified people who could serve as the independent reviewers, they didn't have any behavior analysts as part of that group. And that's not surprising, because behavior analysts were not covered by insurance up to that point. But now that they are, that's something you've got to make sure gets done, is that you have, for purposes of review, appropriate qualified people doing that review. And that goes through all levels and into the independent levels. Some of the weird stuff that can happen is differential diagnosis. I mean, I've seen that happen where someone has said, well, I mean, they have autism, but they may have this other diagnosis. I mean, the answer to that is, as your statute, as all statute says, if you have an autism diagnosis, you're covered, period. So that's, again, kind of an education process that has to occur, where you just need to have people understand, here's the statute, and just need to, you know, have that by you at all times. I think I've got another slide here. All right, I don't even know what the next slide is, so I'm not even going to do it. This is the draft, of course, that I was doing on the plane, so the wrong one got loaded. I must have worked on this or something. But anyway, my final slide, and I know we've got to move on because you all are covering so much ground, but my final slide basically had down passage, implementation, and enforcement. And I want you to always be thinking about that. When you were passing this statute, and even as you're thinking ahead to any further legislation, you need to be thinking about, how am I going to implement this? And what's going to be the ramifications. You did the best job you do, or the better job you do when you pass it, it's going to make implementation easier. The better job you do when you implement it, it's going to make enforcement easier. You're going to cut down on the number of issues, which is what you want to do. If you get to the point that you just have individual issues and individual cases that are things like medical necessity, which is always a determination, that's about the best you can do. You're now in the same boat as everybody else with respect to health care coverage. But you need to try and get rid of some of the systemic stuff. And you need to remember that even after you implement it, there's going to be a need to enforce, and you just have to be prepared to stand up and enforce the statute, and I know you will. So I thank you.